Hi there, my name is Jenny Feick. Welcome to the second in a series of educational videos for the Great Divide Trail Association. We're starting out with videos about the natural history of the Great Divide area. The Great Divide Trail Association is committed to reconciliation, which starts by taking this and every opportunity to acknowledge our honor and privilege to live, work, and play within the Treaty 7 territory. We honor and acknowledge that the GDT passes through traditional Indigenous territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Stoney Iyahe Nakota, the Tsutsena, the Cree, the Shiwepma, the Clay Dana, the Tanaha, the Sinixt, and Métis. The Great Divide Trail Association would like to invite you to advocate for what you love and to preserve nature for future generations to enjoy and appreciate while educating yourselves and others on Indigenous history and perspectives. This video is the second in a series of natural history-oriented presentations called the Nature of the Great Divide series. This particular nature of the Great Divide talk focuses on the tiny but mighty elements of biodiversity along the Great Divide. Before I begin, I'll just share a bit about my background. I have a Bachelor of Science honors in environmental biology with a minor in physical geography, a master's in environmental science, and a PhD in natural resources geography, all from the University of Calgary. During my 25-year coast-to-coast career with Parks Canada, I worked as a park naturalist in Mount Revelstoke and Glacier, Waterton Lakes, and Kootenay National Parks, and then other positions in Banff National Park and Yoho National Park and the Western Regional Office in planning, research, and management, and then a stint out in Atlantic Canada in Terra Nova National Park in Newfoundland. From 2000 to 2012, I managed various programs for the BC provincial government, and I was with the BC Ministry of Environment. And those areas included habitat protection, terrestrial ecosystem science, stewardship outreach, climate change adaptation for nature, and environmental policy. And I retired from full-time government work in 2012. And my husband, Ian Hatter, wildlife biologist, and I now live in Invermere, British Columbia, so we can be closer to the Great Divide Trail than we were when we lived in Victoria. In terms of my connection with the GDT and the GDTA, I was one of the so-called original six on the Project Great Divide Trails crew in 1974, who surveyed the route between Waterton Lakes and Banff National Parks. I was one of the founders of the first Great Divide Trail Association, a past board member, and even a past president for one term. I've hiked a lot of the GDT in sections over the years, although not anything north of Wilmore Wilderness Park yet. When the GDTA was resurrected in 2013, I rejoined and started volunteering on trail work parties and also writing regular articles for the GDTA's Pathfinder newsletter. Lastly, I am the compiler and editor of both of the two editions of Tales from the Great Divide, vignettes on the origins and early history of Canada's Great Divide Trail and Great Divide Trail Association. It's a self-published compendium of the stories from individuals involved firsthand in the start and development of the GDT and the GDTA. Here's what I will cover in this talk. It is amazing how much life abounds even in an area with as challenging a climate and topography as the Great Divide. Most people do not even notice the majority of the life forms along the GDT. The majority of species are small, even minuscule, but they have a powerful influence on what goes on in the ecosystem. In our brief survey of the archaeans, bacteria, protists, fungi, lichens, and some of the less obvious plants, I will focus on some of the tiny but relevant organisms you should know about when you hike the GDT. In the hierarchy of life, most people tend to think of large, multi-celled organisms, especially plants and animals. However, there are millions of life forms that we tend not to notice until they or their absence causes an issue. There's a lot going on in an ecosystem, and particularly the ecosystem through which the GDT passes. Ecosystem processes are the physical, chemical, and biological processes that link organisms and their environment. These include biogeochemical and nutrient cycling, energy flow, food web dynamics, and the cycling of water among the atmosphere, water bodies, water courses, living things, and groundwater. It's the small little things, organisms like the archaeans, bacteria, protists, fungi, lichens, and various plants that you often do not notice that play essential roles in especially the energy, carbon, and nutrient cycling. One whole kingdom of one-celled animals is called the archaeans. Scientists first discovered and described them in Yellowstone National Park in the 1970s. This group includes what are called the extremophiles, minute, one-celled organisms that are able to live in hot springs and other extreme environments, including anaerobic conditions, so places where there's no oxygen, and saline soils, very, very salty soils. Some archaeans live happily as part of a healthy gut biome in the human hikers that visit the Great Divide area. And up until the 1970s, many thought archaeans were bacteria. But bacteria are in a whole other kingdom. These are also one-celled organisms. Cyanobacteria, formerly known as blue-green algae, are photosynthetic microscopic one-celled organisms that are bacteria, not algae. They were originally called blue-green algae because dense growths often called the water green, blue-green, or brownish-green. Cyanobacteria are probably the most numerous taxonomic group to have ever existed on planet Earth, and the first organisms known to have produced oxygen. We owe our oxygen-rich atmosphere today to their proliferation on the Earth millions of years ago. Another group of bacteria called acidobacteria play a vital role in the development of soils in alpine ecosystems, the soils that support all the beautiful wildflowers that we appreciate when we're up in the alpine. Many tiny life forms are lumped into a group called protists, tiny organisms that are not an animal, a land plant, or a typical fungus. These include things like free-living algae, protozoans, which include ciliates, flagellates, heliozoans, and amoebae, and something called slime molds. Some, like the algae, make their own food. Others, including amoeba and the slime molds, are predators. Yet others are parasites. Together, they compose an amount of biomass that is double that of all mammals and other animals. One that you really want to know about is Giardia lamblia. It's an example of a well-known intestinal parasitic protist that causes significant acute and chronic diarrheal disease worldwide. Misnamed beaver fever, this affliction was rare, almost unheard of in the Great Divide area until more people traveled internationally and then were not careful about where they and their dogs defecated while back here at home and hiking in the mountains. While traveling in the backcountry, it's really important to maintain good, healthy hygiene practices to avoid getting giardiasis, is what it's called. So that's things like when you're in camp, always wash your hands before and after handling food or using the latrine, and be sure to urinate or defecate 50 meters or more, so that's around 70 steps, away from any water course or water body, particularly if you or others are taking water from that source to drink. Another tiny invasive parasitic protist from Europe is currently causing great concerns on both sides of the Great Divide. Myoxobolus cerebralis is related to corals, anemones, and jellyfish. It causes what's called whirling disease, which kills young salmonid fishes, including whitefish, trout, and salmon. The disease damages the cartilage in an infected fish's backbone, causing it to swim in an abnormal whirling pattern. And other symptoms include a bent and darkened tail, deformed heads, and bulging eyes. The parasite has a complex two-host life cycle that alternates between a bottom-dwelling tubifex worm and a salmonid fish. This illustrates the interconnectedness of life in ecosystems and how an invasive alien protist from another continent can disrupt those ecosystems and threaten native life forms. And I'll have more to say later about what we can do to stop the spread of whirling disease. Algae are an example of native protists that one can sometimes see in slow-moving creeks or shallow ponds, even in the Alpine. This green algae in the Rockies, it looks like a type of filamentous or unicellular unbranched green algae. Green algae here in the Rockies are found solely in freshwater habitats. Species typically exist as floating mats in stagnant water in ditches and ponds, but some, like this example below the Stanley Glacier Trail in Kootenay National Park, BC, can grow in moving water, attaching themselves to a substrate by rhizoid-like projections of the basal cells, the bottom cells of the filament or stalk. The mat species rise to the surface in early spring and grow rapidly throughout the summer. They usually disappear by late summer, although I took this particular picture in mid-September last year. Members of this group of algae can get parasitized by chytrids, which are the same microscopic fungi that infects and kills many amphibians across North America and the world. Chlamydomonas nivalis is the scientific name for the species of algae that creates the so-called watermelon snow, patches of snow with a pink or red hue. The algae is green when you look at it under a microscope, but develops the pink or red color as a protective barrier, almost like a sunscreen against the sun's ultraviolet rays. Snow algae blooms in the alpine support rich communities, including viruses, bacteria, fungi, ciliates, and small metazoans, and other microscopic organisms. In other words, protists. In turn, snow algae are fed on by creatures such as rotifers, tardigrades, springtails, which you'll hear more about in a future talk, chytrid fungi, and ciliates, establishing the framework for a complex food web on the snow. Climate change threatens alpine snow algae microbiomes as glaciers and permanent snowfields disappear. Snow algae blooms actually amplify the rate of snow loss. The dark red color causes the snow to absorb the sun's heat and thus melt even faster. Not all protists are microscopic in all of their life stages. The slime molds form a plasmodium, which is their predatory feeding stage. They engulf their food, which is mostly bacteria and fungi, and absorb it like a large amoeba with pseudopodia in a process called phagocytosis. The slime mold ingests its food, then digests it. Once the slithering plasmodium depletes its food supply, the slime mold enters its next stage. The mold blob migrates to a location where spores can be released and dispersed. It forms a foamy-like fruiting structure called a sporocarp, which is composed of stalked spore cells. Fungi are in their own kingdom, separate from the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. In the fungi kingdom, there are the chytrid fungi, which I mentioned already, conjugated fungi, sac fungi, club fungi, which in other words are the mushrooms that we typically see, mycorrhizae, molds, and rusts. Fungi are neither plants nor animals. In fact, perhaps counterintuitively, fungi are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. And this is from investigation of the amino acids that make up fungi. They are more similar to the amino acids that animals have than they are to plants. You will probably notice the diversity of club fungi or mushrooms along the GDT, particularly if you hike in the late summer and into the fall. Clockwise from the upper left, there's a large coral fungus. It was the size of a small cauliflower, and it was growing along the Helen Lake Trail in Banff National Park, Alberta. Then there's the fragile brittle gill along the Numa Pass Trail. And there it is, the fragile brittle gill. And the moss, the very diminutive mountain moss Daconica on the Akamina Pass Trail in Alberta. And the red belt conchs growing out of a conifer in Kootenay National Park, BC. It's better to be safe than sorry and not forage for mushrooms while hiking along the GDT. The nutritional value of mushrooms is simply not worth taking the risk of getting poisoned. One of the most important types of fungi are the ones that form networks that link trees as well as other plants in symbiotic or beneficial, mutually beneficial relationships. Mycorrhizae means fungus root. And these mycorrhizal fungi have many branching threads that are called mycelium that grow out from the root tip of a tree and connect with the roots of other trees and plants to form a mycorrhizal network that spans vast areas, connecting trees and plants across a forest. Trees use this network to send and receive chemical messages to one another. In return, the trees provide food that they produce through photosynthesis. This fungal highway provides a direct way for plants to communicate with one another and has been dubbed the Wood Wide Web by Dr. Suzanne Simard. Resources found to transmit through these below-ground pathways include carbon, nitrogen, and water. Rusts are also a type of fungi that infect the leaves of both broad-leaved, deciduous, and evergreen conifer species. Witch's broom is a deformity in a woody plant, typically a tree, where the natural structure of the plant is changed. A dense mass of shoots grows from a single point, with the resulting structure resembling a broom or a bird's nest. Northern gray squirrels, flying squirrels, use them to nest in. The white pine blister rust is another type of rust. It's an invasive alien species that was introduced from Siberia and Europe in the early 1900s, and it kills all the five-needle pines, like whitebark pine and limber pine. The white pine blister rust is one of the main reasons why the whitebark pine and the limber pine have become endangered species in Canada and are listed as such in the Schedule A of the Species at Risk Act. The fungus enters via the needles and spreads. It attacks the tissue and disrupts the flow of nutrients. And a sign of infection are the orange blisters on the bark. Less than 1% of pine can naturally resist this rust. And you can see some of the other rusts on the leaves to the right. There are also a variety of sac fungi called tar spot fungi that live within plant leaves, and in the fall, they emerge and start to break down and decompose the leaves of deciduous trees and forbs. You'll definitely see this when you're hiking up in the alpine and subalpine areas of the Great Divide Trail. It's called snow mold, also known as brown felt blight. And snow mold afflicts the conifers in the upper subalpine forest zone and at tree line that grow in areas of high, long-lasting snowpacks. The fungi develop beneath the snow and produce thick gray felt-like mats of mycelium that smother needles, branches, and twigs. One species affects only pines. The other affects Engelmann spruce, subalpine, and balsam fir. The species that affects pine can penetrate living needles, while the other one, which is shown here, enters the needles and twigs only after they are already dead. As the snow melts, the mycelium turns gray to black and fungal growth ceases. The blight spreads when healthy needles come into contact with infected leaf litter or spores under the snow. Snow mold is not usually a threat to any mature trees, but it can prevent seedlings and saplings from persisting in high alpine areas. It thus helps to maintain tree line and enable the alpine tundra to exist. A different species can cause larch needle blight in larch seedlings and saplings. Lichens are a very complex life form that is a symbiotic partnership of two separate organisms, a fungus and an algae. The dominant partner is the fungus, which gives the lichen the majority of its characteristics, from its basic shape or thallus to its fruiting bodies or reproductive organs. As a result, lichens are classified in the fungi kingdom. The alga partner can be either a green alga, a protist, or a blue-green alga, which is a cyanobacteria, or it can be both. The algae produce the food for the fungus. The fungus supports and protects the algae, enabling them to live in harsh, dry environments where algae would not otherwise be able to survive. Lichens lack roots, stems, and leaves, and their chloroplasts, which enable them to make food through photosynthesis, are contained only in the algae on the top surface of the lichen. Lichens assume three major forms: crustose or crusty, foliose, leaf-like, and fruticose, which are kind of 3D structures. Crustose lichens are just that. They're crusts. And they form a crust over a surface like a boulder, the soil, a tree trunk, or another flat surface. They can come in many bright, vibrant colors like sunny yellow, orange, and red, as well as grays and greens. Crustose lichens are pressed against their substrate. Foliose lichens have two easily distinguishable sides. In other words, there's a top side and a bottom side. They can be very flat, leafy, like lettuce, or convoluted and full of ridges and bumps. Fruticose lichens exhibit a 3D structure. They can be pendant and hair-like, upright and shrubby, or upright and cup-like. Many fruticose lichens have round branches that have a central core, and others are hollow in the middle. Other fruticose lichens have flat branches that tangle up with one another. And while they can be bushy, spindly, stringy, branching, swag-like, or cup-shaped, their main stems are nearly always round in cross-section. Those are the crustose and the foliose. An important type of fruticose lichen is the group called pear lichens. Pear lichens serve as an important winter sustenance for woodland caribou, as well as other ungulates. These include the beard lichens, the usneas, the witch's hair lichens, and the wolf lichens. Now, the wolf lichen is kind of interesting because it's called wolf lichen because they used to use it as a toxin in wolf bait. It's got a yellow compound called vulpinic acid, which is toxic to any predatory species, any species that eat meat, and omnivores like humans or bears and squirrels. But herbivores, like all the hoofed animals, the ungulates, they can eat that lichen and get nutrition from it because they have the digestive enzymes that allow them to break down that acid. And snowshoe hare is another species that can also eat wolf lichen. And there's another lichen pictured here called the yellow lichen that also contains that same type of acid. There is a lot of diversity in lichens along the GDT. Among the numerous species of lichens that you might see are this crustose lichen that I saw. It's called the yellow sunburst lichen along on the Fording Pass Trail in Alberta. The fruticose pixie cup lichens, like this trumpet lichen along the GDT below Fording Pass as well. The foliose leaf lichens, including this shield lichen on a birch tree trunk along Upper Waterton Lake, Alberta, and the yellow lichen which combines both foliose and fruticose characteristics. This one I saw on the Skyline Trail last year in Jasper National Park, right beside the GDT. Although lichens can be found on almost any substrate in any environment, they reach their greatest diversity on the trees, rocks, and soils of moist forests. Rock lichens are among the first organisms to colonize recently glaciated areas, and sometimes the majority of the life forms that you will see in the vicinity of the GDT will be lichens. Let's begin our exploration of the plant kingdom, or the flora of the Great Divide. There are two types of plants: vascular plants and non-vascular plants. Vascular just means that these plants transport fluids containing nutrients up and down their trunks or stems, and non-vascular plants are more primitive and lack the structures needed for fluid transportation within the plant. So they're limited in height as a result of that. Among the flora that you will see along the GDT, particularly in the moister places, are the small non-vascular plants that carpet boggy areas, some forest floors, fallen logs, tree trunks, stumps, and rocks. The non-vascular plants that you are most likely to see along the GDT are mosses. And here are close-ups of some of the dozens of species that you will pass by. Clockwise from the upper left are silvery bryum, which I saw along the Stanley Glacier Trail in Kootenay National Park. And then there's the rough gooseneck moss along the Upper Roe Lake Trail in Waterton Lakes National Park. Red-stemmed feather moss. I actually took this picture in January of this year. It was bright green, no snow under the Engelmann spruce forest, and yellow starry fen moss, again along the Stanley Glacier Trail in Kootenay National Park, BC. And that red stem feather moss was taken near Chevron Lake in Banff National Park. The vascular land plants you are most likely to notice along the GDT are trees, shrubs, and forbs, which are herbaceous flowering plants. And these are going to be the focus of a future video. In this video, I'll tell you about the more primitive ferns and fern allies, and the most advanced group from an evolutionary point of view, the graminoids, or grass-like plants. Ferns are seedless, vascular plants. While the Canadian Rockies lack the abundance of ferns present in the Coast Mountains or even the Columbia Mountains to the west, there are several species that can grow in the mountain valleys and a few at very high elevations near the Great Divide. These include, clockwise from the upper left, oak ferns along Upper Waterton Lake, American parsley fern in a rock outcrop along the Boom Lake Trail in Banff National Park, Alberta, the northern holly fern along the Rockwall Trail in Kootenay National Park, BC, and a deciduous bracken fern in autumn after it's lost its chlorophyll in on the Akamina Pass Trail in Waterton Lakes National Park, Alberta. Ferns are the most advanced group of seedless vascular plants. A more primitive fern ally is the horsetail, or equisetum. There are areas of the GDT that are lined with field horsetail, including the stretch of the GDT in the Upper Barrel Creek headwaters just below Fording Pass. This plant is also known as the scouring rush, and because of the silica it contains in each of its cells, it has an abrasive quality that enables it to be quite effective as a natural hot scrubber. Even more primitive are the club mosses. The two you will see along the GDT are the interrupted club moss underneath coniferous forest canopies at low to mid elevations. This one along the Healy Pass Trail in Banff National Park, and the alpine club moss in very high elevations in the alpine zone. And this one was along the Skyline Trail in Jasper National Park, Alberta. Despite their name, these attractive plants are more closely related to ferns than they are to mosses. And kind of a cute thing, I was once hiking along with a couple of people from the Alpine Club of Canada, and I said, "Oh, here's some Alpine Club moss," and they got all excited, and they thought that there was a moss that had been named after the Alpine Club, but it's Alpine Club moss, not Alpine Club moss. Graminoids are highly evolved herbaceous plants that exhibit a grass-like morphology, i.e. they have elongated stalks or stems called culms, bearing the flowers with long blade-like leaves. Graminoids include the true grasses, sedges, and rushes. Although not showy in any way, these plants provide a lot of the food needed by the wildlife that live near the Great Divide. Graminoids often dominate open habitats such as grasslands or marshes. They can also be found in the understory of forests. Sedges and rushes tend to prefer wetter habitats than grasses. And I have a little rhyme to help you tell them all apart. Sedges have, oops, I did not mean to go back. There we go. Sedges have edges and rushes are round, and grasses have roots that grow deep in the ground. My focus in this talk has been on the organisms in the archaea, bacteria, protista, fungi kingdoms, as well as some of the less noticeable species in the plant kingdom. There are many other small but important organisms that make their home near the Great Divide. These creatures are multi-celled and classified in the animal kingdom and will be the subject of a future talk. The next talk will focus on the plant species you cannot help but notice as you hike the GDT, the trees and shrubs. To wrap up this webinar, I will share a few thoughts on what we can all do to appreciate and safeguard nature along the Great Divide. There are many excellent field guides that you can use to identify the flora and fauna of the Canadian Rockies. One of the most relevant to a topic in this webinar is the mushrooms of the Rocky Mountains. Alpine plants of the Rockies is also pertinent. Due to the weight of field guides, it is best to carry them just on short day trips and use them to build up your identification skills before going out on the GDT for a big section hike or a through hike. The apps are improving, although you still cannot trust the artificial intelligence identifications, especially when you just have evidence of animals such as track or scat or other sign, or if you're trying to identify non-flowering plants or fungi. The Merlin app is absolutely amazing for identifying bird calls, but it uses up a huge amount of your battery resources. Like you can just watch the battery go down as you use it. And so it's again something that you want to use as a technique to learn about things before you actually go out on a long section hike or a through hike. iNaturalist is also very consumptive of iPhone resources. It uses an incredible amount of data unless you take measures to avoid it. And you can do this, just go on the iNaturalist site and type in how can I reduce the amount of use of data use that the iNaturalist app uses, and they'll give you some tips. It's a really good idea to record your observations on iNaturalist, as it improves our collective understanding of which species are where and when. So I certainly encourage people to get an iNaturalist account and start using it. Another couple of books relevant to what I talked about today include The Field Guide to Mosses, Lichens, and Ferns of North America, and a beautifully written, delightful treatise on the natural and cultural history of mosses by Robin Wall Kimmerer, entitled Gathering Moss. Drawing on her diverse experiences as a scientist, mother, teacher, and writer of Indigenous heritage, Kimmerer explains the stories of mosses in scientific terms, as well as in the framework of Indigenous ways of knowledge. And through a series of linked essays, the natural history and cultural relationships of mosses become a powerful metaphor for ways of living in the world. Ian and I enjoyed listening to the audiobook version of this book, read by the author this past winter. We will never ignore mosses again as we walk along trails in the mountains. One of the most important things you can do as a GDT hiker is to help safeguard nature during your trip by adhering to no trace backcountry travel principles. Just type in no trace backcountry principles in your browser and read the material under each of the 7 principles before you head out on the trail. In the fall of 2023, Parks Canada introduced a series of measures to try to slow or prevent the spread of the whirling disease that I had mentioned earlier in the mountain national parks. These include prohibiting fishing, swimming, diving or wading, or using a watercraft of any kind, including stand-up paddleboards, in any park waters. In the summer, people cannot hike, walk, or cycle within 3 meters of any watercourse or water body unless that is on an improved trail, bridge, or ford. One can collect treatable water for drinking purposes. It's good to know that all of the efforts and investments that the GDTA and government land management agencies have made in recent years to build bridges over watercourses along the GDT will help people prevent the spread of this terrible disease that is killing our trout, whitefish, and salmon species. That concludes my summary of the small but mighty organisms of the Great Divide Trail area. If you have any questions after listening to this video, please put them in the YouTube comments along with your contact information, and join me for the next video in this series, which is going to be about trees and shrubs along the Great Divide. Thank you.